What a big week it's been for Donald Trump. When is it ever not? He was at Jimmy Carter's funeral where Obama kind of joked with him, but Mike Pence's wife blanked him. He then made some comments that sounded like he's got a secret plan to invade Greenland. And then today he was in court being sentenced for breaking the law. But the sentence didn't involve a fine or any jail time. We will sum it all up in this episode of Newscast, the BBC's daily news podcast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio, and in the second half of this episode we're going to be discussing some important news about global temperatures and what that means for climate change, and we will help you understand what the numbers mean. But first of all, we're going to cross the Atlantic and get an update on Trump world. Lots been happening with Donald Trump as he gets ready for his inauguration for his second presidential term a week on Monday. We had some comments that were interpreted as him having a plan to invade Greenland, so we'll get a bit more nuance on that. But today, Friday, he was appearing via video link with a court in New York where he was being sentenced after he was found guilty last year over those hush money payments his lawyer paid to Stormy Daniels, the former porn star. The sentence was what's known in the US legal jargon as an unconditional discharge. He still has a criminal record, but he will not pay any fine or serve any jail time. So let's wrap up everything that's been happening because we can cross now to the BBC's chief presenter in Washington, D.C. It's Caitriona Perry. Hi, Caitriona.
Hello, Adam. Good to be with you.
Happy New Year.
You too.
And she's sitting next to senior North America correspondent Gary O'Donoghue. Hello and Happy New Year to you too, Gary.
Happy New Year to you, Adam, as well.
Gary, you've been broadcasting for many decades now. When is the appropriate time to stop saying Happy New Year?
I hate New Year. I must say I avoid it with the plague. I think it's...
Oh, I'm sorry. Oops, trigger warning. Anyway, right, let's move on to the things that you're much more comfortable talking about. Gary, can you please just remind us the actual court case that Donald Trump was being sentenced for today? Because we've had to get our heads around a few of these cases in the last year or so.
Yes, so if you cast yourself back to last New Year, when we were saying Happy New Year, Donald Trump was facing 4 separate criminal cases. And in some ways, this one that's come to a conclusion, or a bit of a conclusion today, was the least serious of them all. And this alleged that he arranged for money to be paid to an adult film actress, Stormy Daniels, ahead of the 2016 election to keep her story quiet in the run-up to Election Day because, say the prosecutors, he felt that would damage his electoral chances. And he arranged this money to be paid by his lawyer, Michael Cohen, who was then repaid, and that was termed legal expenses in the books. And that's what they went after him for and said, no, these weren't legal expenses. These were effectively repaying hush money to a porn star. That's falsifying business records. You did it 34 times because of the various checks that were involved and the countersigning. And we find you guilty on all 34 counts. And that's what the jury decided back in May.
And Caitriona, just talk us through what happened in the courtroom today.
Well, Donald Trump wasn't in the courtroom today. We remember, of course, back from that hearing that Gary's been talking about, Donald Trump marching in and out every day and holding court in the lobby with the awaiting media. These days, of course, we're only 10 days out from him becoming president again, so he's very busy, too busy to concern himself with getting up to court in New York. So he joined virtually, sitting beside his lawyer, Todd Blanche, who he has tapped to be the Deputy Attorney General, so he won't be his lawyer in these matters for much longer in this way. So they were sitting together on a screen with American flags behind them. And the hearing itself was pretty short, just about less than an hour or so. We heard from the chief prosecutor, then we heard from Todd Blanche, Donald Trump's lawyer, and then we heard from the judge, Juan Merchan, handing down the sentencing verdict. And I suppose, unlike what we're used to in court cases, there was no real element of jeopardy here at all because it had been signalled well in advance by the prosecution and by Judge Merchan himself that Donald Trump was not going to get a custodial sentence. He wasn't going to get a big fine. He got what's called unconditional release, which means nothing, basically. He is still a convicted felon, but he doesn't have to pay any money. He doesn't have to do any jail time. And crucially, as the judge pointed out, it kind of closes up that chapter of the proceedings and allows Donald Trump now to officially launch his appeal against all of this, which he is definitely doing.
That's the irony of this, Adam, is that all these attempts to stop this sentencing happening were stopping him going through the appeal process, which he can now do, which is perfectly possible way of overturning this conviction because of what the Supreme Court said earlier in the year about immunity from prosecution. And this changes the whole game, whereas he was actually delaying the process whereby he could actually clear his name through that appeals process. He did have a long sort of speech, sort of pretty rambling speech to the court. I cut and pasted it into Word, and I counted 1,079 words. Not much, by the way, of punctuation, but a sort of what you would normally expect from him, a series of gripes and complaints and relitigating the case and the political witch hunt, all the sort of normal stuff you would expect.
And one of the words, Caitriona, I was just going to say, one of the words that would appear in Gary's Word document, if you did Control F and look for it, would be lawfare. He talked about this concept of lawfare quite a lot.
Yeah, and what was really interesting, though, about Donald Trump speaking today was the fact that he chose to speak today, because he didn't speak at all on the record during the original hearing. He was offered the opportunity to take the box himself, and he chose not to. But in speaking today, he still has put all of these issues on the record. So should there be an appeal now, these things can also be looked over. And it was the classic hits, as you were saying there, Gary, wasn't it? Like this issue about how, it wasn't a legitimate case, it wasn't appropriate to have been brought in the first place. And he had said when he was listening to the prosecutor going back over the case, he was like, hey, I've been here because I listed legal expenses as legal expenses, and actually I didn't even do that, it was my accountant. Yeah. So it was kind of like he was hearing some of this for the first time, I thought, wasn't it, in how he was approaching it, but resolutely not deviating from his view that
he's
this should
angry,
never
he?
have he's really angry. And I mean, talking about it in this country, as in very many other countries, he has a criminal record now, and there is a stigma attached to that. He's forever a convicted felon pending that appeal. And for someone like Donald Trump, who prides himself on being so successful and moving in really high fancy circles and all of that, he's a criminal, and he can't get away from that at this point, pending that appeal.
But yet, on the other side of this equation, like when he actually is president again, he's been given quite a lot of legal backing by the Supreme Court when they made a ruling last year about the powers of the president when it comes to doing things that some people might think are against the law, Gary.
And I think there are two parts to that. Yes, you're absolutely right about that. That will give him a lot of confidence in pressing forward with some of the more perhaps extreme things that we've heard about that he wants to do. And if you add into that the fact that this time around, he's not been persuaded to have some sort of safe hands, members of the old guard in key positions in his administration. So, when he had James Mattis, 4-star Marine General, in the Defense Department, he had Rex Tillerson at the State Department, all these people that actually talked him out of a lot of stuff, stopped him doing a lot of stuff. He's not got that this time. He's picked a bunch of people who are going to do exactly what they're asked by him. And if you add that to the Supreme Court immunity judgment last year, that is a pretty potent mix coming into inauguration, the first 100 days, and 2 years where he also controls Congress as well.
And Caitriona, just remind us, the Supreme Court said that if a president does something that's part of his duties as president, it can't be illegal.
The key part of the ruling was while in office, and that's actually what Donald Trump is using in some of these other cases is, he's saying, well, presidential immunity should be there forever previous to being in office, which is what he was arguing in this hush money case because these payments were made before he was elected. But the Supreme Court ruling is very clear on when you're in office that you have this level of immunity.
Right, let's talk about a few other things that have happened. Caitriona, yesterday, Jimmy Carter's funeral, so much speculation about the lip reading, because all the living presidents were in the first two rows and some presidential candidates who'd failed were there too.
I mean, it was fascinating viewing. Sumi and myself were hosting another marathon broadcast, and we were glued to those images. First, when Donald Trump and Melania Trump arrived and he shook hands with Mike Pence, but not with Karen Pence. She stayed sitting down. Then there's a strict protocol to how people are seated. So Barack Obama was then sat next to Donald Trump, and crucially, Michelle Obama was in Hawaii on a prior arrangement, so she didn't attend the funeral. Had she been there, she would have been seated next to Donald Trump, and we all remember everything she said about Donald Trump over the years, so that would have been an even more awkward conversation. But Barack Obama and Donald Trump leaning into each other, having these conversations, and so many media organisations here, Adam, you're right, have hired in these professional forensic lip readers to try and make out what they were saying. And snatches of the conversation was about, you know, we need to get a private space to talk later. I'll talk to you about that, a very important issue. And, you know, people are trying to deduce, gosh, what's that all about? What do presidents have to talk about? Many important issues.
They should take a lesson from the Premier League, where the footballers do this thing, don't they?
Oh yeah, hold your hand up and speak
for
behind.
Their teammates, you know, don't do that.
Yeah, and then you had Kamala Harris and her husband Doug Emhoff arrive and sit in front of the past and soon to be future president and the other past presidents, and, you know, just casting a glance behind, and, you know, you're sort of like, was that a slight eye roll? What was that?
Side eye.
You know, and Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton sitting further down the bench. And what was striking, which was mentioned to me by some people, is that, you know, firstly, there was no woman speaking from the altar at the church, even though Jimmy Carter was such an advocate for women's rights and the promotion of women. And then you had all these past presidents, all men, sitting there, and the two women who've tried to make it, Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris, sitting there as well. And it was just such an interesting snapshot of this country.
Right, Gary, this is probably an impossible question to answer, but let's give it a go. What?
He'll be able.
Well, as I said, decades of doing this. Not that you haven't, Caitriona. You can also feel like the best as well. But what I was getting
well,
at,
I'm
Gary,
so young. Thank you. I'll take that.
what I was getting at, Gary, though, was like, what do we actually think Donald Trump's intentions are when it comes to Greenland? Because a lot of green ink and other colours of ink have been spilt over the last few days trying to interpret his comments at a press conference a couple of days ago.
I don't think he knows what his intentions are at this stage. I don't have any particular evidence for knowing that. I'd be surprised if even those around him have a clear understanding of what the end point is on this. I think there's, it's worth saying, Greenland is not the first time, Donald Trump is not the first president to talk about Greenland. In fact, I think from memory, and this, correct me, I'll be corrected if I'm wrong by your dear listeners, I think Harry Truman talked about taking over Greenland.
In the 40s.
In the 40s. So, it's a strategic place. The Arctic Circle, we know, has become a much more militarized and economic area of importance in terms of minerals and all that kind of thing. Donald Trump has said this before. And one of his things he does is he says something reasonably outrageous as a starting point publicly, so that, you know, I think he feels that really sort of sets the table for to his advantage before real negotiations can begin. Do I think he would send troops to invade Greenland? I think that's incredibly unlikely. Do I think he might try and do a deal where more American troops are based there? There are more bases there? Yeah, perhaps. And there may be and there probably are good strategic arguments for that. Does Greenland want independence from Denmark? We're told it does. Might it be persuaded to have a much closer relationship with the US, somewhere short of being subsumed? Possibly, maybe even probably. So all these things are out there. We'll see how far it goes. I can't think this is the top of his agenda, because, you know, he wants to do the immigration stuff. He wants to do the trade stuff. He wants to sort out Ukraine and the Middle East. That would be, you know, a whole presidency's worth of effort, as well as tax cuts and all that, let alone Greenland and the Panama Canal.
I think as well, I mean, we heard Donald Trump talk about Greenland in 2019, I think, when he was president originally. So there is something there in the back of his mind, or at least in the minds of the team around him. And I think when you mentioned, Gary, there about Greenland potentially seeking independence from Denmark, like that's where you get the NATO partners starting to get a bit worried,
Like
because
France, Germany,
an independent Greenland, is that still a NATO member? Probably not, or it has to go through some kind of process.
Yeah.
And when we've seen everything in recent months from Russia and China and their military exercises in that part of the world, it just makes a lot of people very nervous. So, Greenland has a strategic importance, and I think this is Donald Trump flying that flag, to get the conversation going, as Gary's describing there. But there's probably something to it as well.
But America is built on this idea of anti-imperialism. It was set up as an anti-imperialist power. It has set itself up as against the old world, against those kind of empire building that Britain did, that Spain did, Portugal, France, the Netherlands, everyone did. And this is another way in which Donald Trump has completely turned the sort of the DNA of the country around, talking about this sort of acquisitional approach to other bits of the world, which is completely contrary to what the founding fathers, which Republicans love, completely contrary to their whole ethos. So.
I think it's a muscle flex, though, a bit, isn't it? It's absolutely. Like, America could do this. I could do this as president, and watch out, everyone else. I'm the biggest, strongest kid in the playground.
Yeah.
And also, just a lot of this comes from, he was asked a question by a journalist: can you rule out using economic or military means to achieve a few objectives, one of which was Greenland? And he wouldn't rule them out. Now, very few presidents would want to constrain their options by ruling out things in future. It's just they probably use slightly more diplomatic language to convey that, whereas Donald Trump just said, no, I can't give you that assurance.
I guess, although I don't think you give up much by saying I'm not going to invade a fellow NATO country.
True.
That's not a big concession.
True. Right, last question. And I don't know which one of you wants to take this one, but when do you think we will see President Trump sitting down with President Putin? Because Donald Trump has been saying that he's accepted an invitation from the Russian president for a chat.
Bratislava was one
I would
suggestion
think
I saw.
pretty soon.
Yeah. Did you see Slovakia was one?
Yeah, I think we'll see that pretty soon. God, I don't want to put a specific date on it, but Putin wants it, and I think Trump probably wants it. And again, it's to sort of show, this is how strong and powerful I am, and I talked to everyone, and I told you I'm going to get a deal in Ukraine, Russia, and this is a step to doing it.
But he's got to be haunted by Helsinki, hasn't he? I mean, I was there in Helsinki, and that was such a car crash.
Yeah.
Where he kind of effectively dumped on his whole intelligence community and said, I kind of believe Vladimir actually on this one.
Yeah.
So that's got to be in his memory, surely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and of course, Gary, you were talking about that Helsinki meeting between Trump and Putin it was 2018, wasn't it? And basically at the news conference at the end of the meeting, Trump had basically sided with Putin over the FBI about election interference, and that was seen as quite embarrassing for the FBI and sort of unpatriotic by Trump. Right, on that note, I'm going to say thank you very much and good luck for the inauguration in the next few weeks, Caitriona.
Thank you. I'll be layering up my clothes in anticipation of that one, standing on the Capitol for hours and hours. Yeah,
Lots of thermals.
And Gary, just one last time, Happy New Year.
Thanks, Adam. Just from you.
Now, as promised, some new data about global temperatures, and experts have found and calculated that in 2024, the average global temperature was 1.5 degrees higher than pre-industrial levels before mankind started putting loads of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And the reason that number is significant is because in the Paris Climate Change Agreement of 2015, which kind of governs the world's battle against climate change and countries' commitments to cut greenhouse gases, the target is to limit the increase in global temperatures to no more than 2 degrees by the end of the century, and if possible, no more than 1.5 degrees. So that's why that 1.5 degrees is such a kind of crucial threshold. And this data shows that last year, for 1 year, that threshold was breached. So what does that mean? And also, what does this mean for efforts to battle climate change and deal with greenhouse gas emissions in a country like the UK. We can chat now to Emma Pinchbeck, who's the Chief Executive of the Independent Climate Change Committee, which is the body that advises and monitors government on its progress towards its climate change goals. Hello, Emma.
Hello.
All settled into the new job now? Because last time we spoke, you were on day 3 or 4 or something.
Yeah, no, I found my laptop now, and I have had 2 months to get up to speed with everything. So that's a lifetime in Policyland.
Good. Right. So just talk us through this piece of data we've got today from Copernicus, from the EU's climate satellite monitoring network. Just spell it out for us.
So what the satellite has recorded for the first time are global temperatures at 1.5 degrees, which listeners might be aware of as the global target that we're trying to stay below in terms of human-induced warming from the past. And it's really important that people know that that target hasn't in fact been breached, even though we've now got this one measurement at 1.5 degrees, because the target is about multi-decade or very clear human influence climate change. And when you measure that, we think we're still a degree or two beneath 1.5. But that isn't to say that this isn't, bad news in terms of the direction of travel for the warming planet.
And just with your knowledge of all these climate negotiations, which you've been at in various different guises, just explain the significance of the 1.5 figure, and also the fact that there's also a 2 degrees figure in the Paris Climate Change Agreement as well.
Yeah, the agreement is well below 2 degrees and aiming for 1.5. And I was actually at the Paris conference where that threshold was negotiated. And rather than give you the sort of technical explanation of it, what I will say to you is that we understood that from the climate change movement and as experts as the difference between very vulnerable countries experiencing catastrophic impacts through to something that looked more survivable. I realize this is quite extreme language, but 1.5 was felt to be a fair reflection of what countries like the Marshall Islands or the very vulnerable nations thought was appropriate for their countries and their populations would be able to continue with their way of life. Although those nations are already experiencing, impacts. The Marshall Islands is a good example of a country where the president has been appealing for other countries to help take in his population. So it's a really important target because it's the best that scientists could come up with to signal a level that our current way of living was deemed to be able to continue and the worst impacts to be avoided.
And I remember when the UK was hosting the climate change conference in Glasgow a couple of years ago, COP26, one of the catchphrases that Alok Sharma, the chair of it, used was, we want to keep the goal of 1.5 alive. And at the end of it, he said, yeah, okay, we haven't got everything we wanted at this conference, but we've kept 1.5 alive. Is it still alive today?
Yes, it's still alive today. So the good news is the Committee on Climate Change's job is to work out whether or not there is a feasible, technically deliverable, economically fair, socially beneficial pathway to delivering 1.5. We're about to give our advice to government again this spring. For the UK's contribution, we're very clear that we can meet a pathway in line with 1.5 degrees. And for the world overall, absolutely there's scope still to hit 1.5. I think every year where we don't see action in line with the science, it gets harder and harder to meet a target quite clearly. But the physics of it is still possible if we get action immediately from governments. And that will, I'm sure, be what they're talking about at the next climate conference when it comes up in Brazil.
And when your predecessors at the committee published their last progress report, what were kind of the big things that they said the government's got to get on and do, and what were the milestones that were attached? Remind us.
For our international commitment, which was what I was talking to you about last time, Adam, for the 2035 target in the UK, what we really need to crack on with is lots and lots of clean electricity, and then lots and lots of using that clean electricity in homes and transport systems. And that basically means building clean forms of power, and then getting people to start adopting heat pumps when they go to replace their boiler, and getting people to buy electric vehicles. And electric vehicles are going to go faster than heat pumps over the next decade. But the really big story for the next decade is heat and transport. there are other things we need to do, but that's the big chunk of it for the next 5 to 10 years.
And are you able to sort of take a view on the first 6 months of this new government and how well they're doing?
Well, we formally do that every year. So we get to do that in the summer, and our formal progress report will come in the June of this year, which feels fair given that they've only been in place for 6 months. What we said at the end of last year, though, when the government had been in office for a few months, was that the really big thing is to make electricity cheap. And that's because of this electrification story we're talking about over the next 10 years. There were 10 recommendations we made, and kind of many others in the report overall. But the really key one that we haven't seen much movement on is this point about cheap electricity, as well as then taking action on things like the heat and transport, as I've already said. The reason I keep banging on about it is it was important for my last job working in the energy sector as well as this one. And I think it's important for the economy to have cheap, clean power. But we know people are struggling with their bills at the moment as well. So whether or not you care about bills, if you care about economic growth, or as the committee does, your job is to get emissions out of the UK economy, lots of clean, cheap electricity really matters.
So, but this is an impossible question to answer because it's nuanced, but at what point do we need to see and feel the cost of electricity going down? Because, I mean, I look at my smart meter and I get my notifications from the energy company. Exactly, still doing that. Although it's been quite scary the last couple of days.
Yeah, sorry.
It's in the spare room now, rather than in the living room. And but because and the energy price cap is going up all the time as well. So like people's lived experience of energy, is it getting more expensive like every quarter?
Yeah, well, we've said as soon as possible in terms of making electricity cheap, because we are going to be getting people or asking people to take on new electrical products like EVs and heat pumps. And actually, really importantly, for the businesses that want to offer those to people, they can do things like finance them, invest in them, make them cheaper, train skilled engineers if they can see good market conditions for doing that. And an essential market condition is a cheap fuel to run them. So we've been extremely clear that that's a priority recommendation. There are others. People can find the report online. Everything the CCC does is transparent. And we will give the government more advice on what more they can do this spring and hold them to account for Parliament in the summer. And
just a few other things that are going on in the world at the moment. I know it's very tricky to attribute certain natural disasters to climate change, but what's a way of thinking about the wildfires in California from a climate change point of view?
I think if you asked the scientists on the committee, what they would say is you have to think about climate change as a sort of magnifying glass or an accelerant on these extreme weather events. So more of them and more extreme events. So California has had wildfires before, but the fires will be more intense and they may happen with more regularity. I think I'm right in saying it's December in California, for example. So it would be relatively unusual to have a fire of this sort of scale at this time of year. And Catherine Hayhoe, the American climate scientist, has a great phrase, which she says it shouldn't be global warming, it should be global weirding, just more weird extreme weather because of that overall temperature increase, which doesn't sound that big, but has big consequences. In the UK, we're already feeling those impacts in the case of things like flooding. So 1 in 100 year events happening more regularly, becoming 1 in 50 year events or 1 in 10 year events, and the water level coming up higher than it used to. It's that kind of effect.
And are you seeing any evidence of the British government, of whichever political party's in charge at the time, spending more money on that stuff, which is what we call adaptation, so adapting to the fact that the climate is going to be different?
A really big message for me coming into this job and seeing the work of the committee, which covers adaptation and what we call mitigation, reducing emissions, has been that I don't think the weight, funding, political attention, interest is there on adaptation in the way that it is on emissions reduction. And the committee's published advice to government has been they need to do far more in this space. The government, in its response to the last advice from the committee, has said they're going to pull together a group from cabinet across government to look at adaptation and come up with a strategy for it. That would be welcome. And they have spent some money on things like flooding, but it's not enough. And I suppose, just stepping back from it, you need the same level of strategic focus and interest from government on this as you have on tackling emissions, because we're now in an era where we're facing those impacts, and everyone has a story about being impacted by, flooding, or, the railways not working on days of extreme heat, or being in a city in a building where it's stifling hot because you have a 40-degree summer. These kinds of things are things that affect the economy, but they also affect people. They affect the NHS. The whole of government really needs a response to them.
One of the other stories we saw a few weeks ago was about the Vauxhall factory in Luton potentially closing down, or actually closing down. And it's to do with this zero emissions vehicle mandate. So this new law that car companies have to sell a percentage of electric vehicles every year, and it goes up and up and up. And there's penalties if they don't. But on the other side, there's things that they can do to try and make up the shortfall in their bit of the cap. Is that the proof, though, that actually there are economic consequences? Because whenever we talk, you're like, oh no, it's wrong to say, oh, it's all costs and no benefits. Actually, you can have win-wins, but in that situation, that was a lose for the car company.
I think it is probably more complicated than that. And then sitting now outside,
I think probably yes,
private sector, yeah, probably a bit more complicated than just being about mandate. And one of the things I'd say there is, for the automotive sector, a big pressure on them actually is that China has moved very, very quickly on electric vehicles. 50% or so of new car sales in China are now electric vehicles. And a lot of the European car manufacturers had a big export market to China, which is now complicated if they don't have a good long range vehicle. And they're struggling to work out what their product is for export now, with that big challenge from the Chinese industry. And so arguably the example there is perhaps we didn't go fast enough to get ahead of that change relative to our other big markets. So it's always about export rather than domestic use. Domestically, again, how government does this is sort of for them, not for the committee. We're a advisory body. We're not politicians. But what we've said on that particular policy issue is it's really, when we talk to the public about our advice, they want more clarity from government about the technologies they're expected to adopt. They're willing to adopt them. And they also need government to get the price down, and having a strong market signal, something like saying, that there was a proposed phase out date for EVs, for example. You've got to have a consumer pull in order for the market to then ramp up demand. And I've got a lot of sympathy for the automotive industry saying they just haven't had that. They haven't had that clarity about what the government wants people to do. And that's advice that we've previously offered to government.
And just to be clear on that, so that the ban on the sale of new petrol and diesel vehicles was going to be 2030. Rishi Sunak pushed that back to 2035. Labour campaigned on the general election of bringing it back to 2030. Is that actually happening? Is that change coming in?
I think there's a consultation on it. And again, you have to get the business secretary in front of you and ask them, and the transport secretary. But what the committee have said is you need a consumer signal, and you need very clear public messaging about what we're all expected to do, so that businesses can invest, so that businesses can get the cost down. Because if you just have something for business and you don't have the demand pool, then obviously there's a kind of cost, but they don't have the market. So we're waiting to see what the government does. But from a carbon point of view, surface transport is now a quarter of UK emissions. And so we absolutely do need people to be adopting electric vehicles.
Emma, thank you very much. I know you're off to do the school run. Which transport mode will you be using?
My electric vehicle, which I have remembered to charge. I did a select committee this week where I talked about it in the first week of owning it. We forgot to charge it once, and it made newspaper headlines. So I should be clear that I love our EV.
And we should do our update of how I'm doing with shifting my electricity from peak times to off-peak times. I got the email yesterday. We didn't register any shifts in your electricity use this time, which means you didn't earn any extra credits on your bill. We know it can be harder to shift in some weeks than others, so there's always next time. Thank you very much, Energy Company. Emma, I think I can hear the school bell ringing.
You can.
So I'll let you go. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Right, that's all for this jam-packed episode of Newscast. Laura and Paddy will be back with the weekend edition very soon. Bye-bye.